haven't seen Mark's video on these yet. We'll probably watch it after I put this up. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new triple album from Patricia Taxxon, Das Triadische Ballett, Gelb, Rosa und Schwarz. Okay, it's been a little bit since I've talked about Patricia Taxxon. For those not already familiar with this ever-prolific artist, I've now done 5 previous videos going through her work. Enough now to fill up a playlist, which I'll link in the description. It's basically a full discography review if you count the in brief segments and prelude sections. And 4 of those 5 videos are from before she came out as transgender, so fair warning there. But okay, let's do our usual catch-up on the projects she's dropped since my last video on her. The last project I covered from her was Pix and Bit, a mostly EDM project that I thought may very well have been her best work to date, which was also released concurrently with Beauty, a Nightcore EP, which was way better than any Nightcore project I've ever heard, and by that I mean it was pretty decent. And moving into 2020, she's put out 4 other albums before this new trilogy. To kick off the new year, she put out Jackrabbit, a heavily Outica-inspired IDM album, specifically trying to evoke their Confield and LP5 era. Not exactly my personal favorite period of their work, and it did in fact end up more something I respect for how ridiculously far she's come on a technical production level, rather than something I'd want to come back to a lot on my own time. But still turned out pretty dang solid all around, and the project did get markedly better in its second half when she incorporated more of her own easily recognizable melodic stylings. Then in March, we got Serpentagon, which was basically a less impactful rehash of Jackrabbit. It was more melodic, less overtly harsh sounding on average, more the kind of thing I could easily recognize as her work from a distance down to every single sound design element that went into it, but weirdly didn't resonate nearly as strongly with me as I'd like, aside from a few choice moments. All the noisier percussion breakdowns were really starting to run together for me and lose their initial luster, and the more ambient-centric moments here, while generally bigger highlights, weren't exactly the absolute best I'd ever heard from her in that vein either. Bit of a letdown, honestly. Kind of felt like she was running on autopilot for that one. But only about a week after that project, we got Rainbow Road, her spiritual sequel to her Traveler album from 2018, which more successfully captured the synthwave genre than last time, though also feeling pretty trance-ish in many parts. I think it was even a solid improvement on Traveler. And then in April, we got Dance Odyssey, her spiritual sequel to perpetual personal favorite, Winter Beats, albeit this time with more modernized EDM-style production, starting out all abstract and John Hopkins-inspired, and getting more mainstream sounding as it went along. There's like a whole segment that interpolated the melody from Alice DJ's Better Off Alone 25 minutes in, and right after that it paid off in like this big 2014 style modern dubstep drop, and then closing with a light and airy piano and glockenspiel section. Almost felt like the kind of thing that was specifically designed to be up my usual alley, and it very much turned out that way. Didn't have enough to say about it to make a proper video on it, and still felt more like a side offering from her, but yeah, I enjoyed it just as much as you would expect. That was great, definitely hanging on to it long term. But that brings us to here. Whatever this was going to be, I think we all knew it was going to be a big deal. I think she tweeted at one point that she was planning to do a freaking triple album and was consistently hinting that it was going to be this really big, high-effort thing that she more or less saw as the definitive Patricia Taxxon experience. Which, the very second that I heard this was going to be a thing and how long it was, I was like, yeah, there is no way I am not reviewing this. And on top of that, you remember how Pix and Bit was kind of a weird first for her because she released a pre-album single from it, and ordinarily she prefers to keep her albums as unbroken unified statements? Well, for this project, she released 6 pre-album singles, 2 from each of the 3 albums. I didn't listen to any of the singles as they were coming out because I knew there would be an album on the way. I just wanted to hear it all in context. Maybe kind of briefly sampled through them a little and not much else. But yeah, first she released a cover of MIA's Paper Planes, then a microtonal pop song called Spiral Staircase, a cover of Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, an up-tempo EDM banger called Try the Wine, a cover of Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke, and finally a piano and vocaloid ballad called Something Pretty. Even though I wasn't really listening to these singles, I could tell by just how much was being dropped that this was going to be one hell of a listen, and a big important event that I had no intention of missing. And the project finally dropped in its full 2.5-hour glory, broken up into 3 separate releases called Gelp, Rosa, and Schwarz, dropping one after another over the course of the last 3 days of June. But pretty clearly meant to come together in the same package, collectively called Das Triadische Ballett. I admittedly wouldn't have thought much of that title at first until I saw people predicting the pattern of how the projects were being named and themed, so I looked it up, and then I found out that this trilogy is named after an actual avant-garde ballet developed by Oskar Schlemmer in 1912 while he was a part of the Bauhaus School of Art. Hence why there's also a track called Bauhaus on the Gelp album. And said ballet was also separated into 3 sections which had yellow, pink, and black backdrops respectively. And obviously this trilogy of albums forms a loose concept based directly off this ballet and conveying the moods described of the 3 segments. Like Wikipedia says that the yellow segment was to create a cheerful burlesque mood, the pink segment was festive and solemn, and the black segment was mystical and fantastic, and that's also a pretty accurate description of the respective moods created by the 3 parts of the album as well. Kind of reminds me of when she made that one IDM album eons ago and tried to get every track to evoke the style of a famous painter or visual conceptual artist. Either more or less in-depth than that, depending on which way you look at it. Needless to say, I was pretty damn hyped to get into this project, and I'm quite happy to say that it turned out exactly as good as I expected it would be. All 3 albums were great right on first listen and never felt like they overstayed their welcome even when I listened to the whole trilogy all in one go. I'm not sure yet if I consider her best overall. None of the 3 albums are on that level when taken purely as individuals, though if I lump all 3 together as one project, then hell yeah, it's right up there with Pix and Bit and Winter Beats, easily. All 3 albums are really good to great, but I feel like you kinda gotta put them together to really get the full effect. But yeah, the production is excellent across the board, at least on par with Pix and Bit and even surpassing it in many parts. And the vast majority of the trilogy is done in the same style of that album. Her typically unique take on some modern EDM and electropop styles, but with some particularly abstract and artsy twists on everything, stretching out into a lot of different territory that touches on modern dubstep, complextro, electro house, quite a bit of that. Also plenty of IDM, some ambient stuff, some trance and progressive house type stuff, and lots more, with vocals sometimes delivered herself, but sometimes handing it over to some guest singers, and actually a lot more frequently using like Vocaloid and other vocal synthesis programs like that and working them into the mix pretty effectively. Not every track is wall-to-wall incredible, not that I was really expecting that to be the case given its size, but certainly in terms of scope and variety and density, this is easily the most impressive thing she's put out to date. If she set out to basically put out the definitive Patricia Taxxon experience, I think she pretty effectively pulled that off here. So, we got a lot to go through, let's not waste any more time and go into the first of the 3 projects, Gelp. The brightest, the most banger-heavy, the most cheerful in the trilogy, certainly the best place to start off. Also easily the tightest of the 3 projects, and the one that comes together the most seamlessly. Even if it's not like a continuous mix or anything, it feels like these tracks are almost directly building off each other, feeling like they're picking up with where the previous one left off. He wastes absolutely no time pulling you in right away with the title track. All 3 albums start with their title track, and Gelp is definitely the best of the openers, a nice meaty 7-minute overture that sets the tone of the project and is just an awesome ride. Stuttering percussive melodic synth stabs, filtered string orchestra sounds, change-ups into different sections which aren't that fundamentally different in style but all slightly changing their synth textures, even got some fluty noises in the last stretch. And then we go into Alien, which I don't even really notice is a different song for a good 20-30 seconds until her singing comes back in. The track itself, I wouldn't say it's a massive standout on the album, but it is still very good. Kinda reminds me of stuff you'd find on her Wavetable album, but just better executed across the board, switching between these poppier stretches with her singing over the sharp melodic leads and frantic but slower-paced beats that sometimes have a very low-mixed buzzing sound in the background that keeps making me think my phone is vibrating, with her lyrics warning about some kind of oncoming disaster. Yeah, I feel that. And of course that all pays off in the super harsh and abrasive metallic modern dubstep lubbing. Even got a nice coda where she just puts a bunch of auto-tune on her voice for the hell of it. It's pretty solid, if not my favorite use of these styles she's done either before or even just elsewhere on this particular project. But thankfully next is Try the Wine, which is this project's equivalent to Cilantro. The bouncy and heavily catchy attention-grabbing banger. The synth tones are pretty flat and electro house-y across the board, but still have quite a bit of punchiness to them, and the Vocaloid vocals and the verses on this one are totally slurring all their words together to the point of being pretty difficult to understand. But the melodies are all great to well make up for it, and the shouting refrain of, "Hey, get on the roof, we'll count the stars, hey, get on the roof, we'll count the stars," is just gonna keep sticking with me. Probably my favorite track on Gelp overall. Jackrabbit, meanwhile, goes for a comparatively more simplistic route. It's one of those 6-8 time tracks a la Did Mouse Right This Second, and just all instrumental with no drop sections, just triumphant lead melodies blaring out over a stuttering beat. Still has quite a lot of punch and impact to it, and the way those melodies just keep adding little flourishes between notes prevent this track from feeling too overly simple or not fitting with the project's vibe. And then there's the Sir Duke cover, which, yeah, easily the best of the 3 cover songs. It doesn't change the song a lot aside from the full electro-pop makeover the whole thing has and changing the key up and down quite a bit. Otherwise sounds exactly what you would think Patricia Taxxon covering Sir Duke would sound like. But it's still awesome. The inherent funkiness in Stevie Wonder's composition adds a lot of flavor to this track that has a lot of the same sharp electro house tones that the rest of Gelp had thus far, and make it particularly stand out in the track listing while not sounding out of place. The generated vocals on this one admittedly barely even sound like vocals at all, more like a keyboard line that kinda sorta resembles vowel sounds sometimes. But hey, it sounds good, not gonna complain there. Another one of the best tracks on here. Now, the last stretch of Gelp is unfortunately not as strong as the way it starts, but it's still pretty good. Fighting Trim, that was pretty consistently my least favorite track on this volume. The maybe synthesized female lead vocals in the chorus have this weird yelping inflection to them, and the way they just keep squealing and shouting away, it got kind of grating. Patricia's own singing was a lot more pleasant to hear. But she just runs with the yelping vocals anyway, the ending where she just key changes up and up and up and that voice gets higher and higher, just taking this idea to the furthest possible extreme, and that rough and noise-heavy instrumental going up against these voices just make the whole mix sound absolutely demented and purposefully unstable. Still had me like, you know what, I can still respect this. I may not have loved the core idea, but she went all the way with it and had it come around by the end. Not bad at all. But then we got Bauhaus, which I wonder if you'd given this to me in 2014 if I would have thought it was crap. Because the bulk of this track is, like, near atonal with a metallic banging trap beat and these growling electro synths that sound like they're saying blah, 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 blah. Not to mention all the distorted, screeching, fuzzed out noise bursts that come in at various intervals. It's a lot, to say the least, and taking cues from lots of styles I've never particularly cared for. But the sheer amount of detail that goes into it still gives me plenty to latch onto. Still didn't mention the little breakbeats used as drum fills, or the various layers of metallic clanging in the background that sound like you're repeatedly squeezing wind chimes together. Or the fact that halfway in the track some proper melody shows up and creating this absolutely badass progression out of it. I mean, first listen of this I wasn't sure about this track, but the sheer amount this track just bangs is undeniable, and it's become a pretty clear favorite now. And finally, Gelp closes with Hellbulb, one of the few tracks on here with an actual human guest vocalist. Danny Wade returns on this one. She's worked with Patricia a few times before on Two Tone and The Best Day. And this track is basically an all-around better version of Fighting Trim. Same sort of noisy electro house instrumental that often gets pretty unstable along with Wade's own performance. And some lyrics that have some pretty damn loaded imagery, like the chorus is talking about coming to Columbine Deluxe, as it's some kind of, like, massively immoral show with tickets for sale. But the outro also kind of describes it as, like, the last show remaining in some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario, I guess. Kind of relating back to Alien, maybe? Pretty good stuff all around. A satisfying way to finish the album, even if I go on and off with that one, whether it's one of my big favorites from here. So yeah, Gelp, it's overall hard-hitting, well-produced, if often abrasive, colorful and detailed, flows really well too. Just taken on its own, it'd probably be her single most successful exploration into EDM, save for picks and bits. Obviously didn't have the same amount of immediate enjoyability and replayability, though it is a lot more creative and unique experience. Certainly not bulletproof, but very tight and concise, and certainly leaves an impact, enough to merit a solid 8 out of 10 by itself. But that brings us to the second volume in this trilogy, Rosa. Rosa is admittedly the weakest of the 3 albums, by merit of being the least adventurous from a sound design perspective, notably drier and more plain sounding than the other 2, and mostly just sticking to her usual brand of plinking melodic synth textures and not much else. But it seems to be focusing more of its efforts on the actual melodies and chord progressions, delving more into the music theory side of things and getting more complex in that department. And there are still quite a few tracks that have more interesting textures that stand out much more as well. Where Gelp was just always in your face and firing on all cylinders, Rosa is comparatively more delicate, more emotional, perhaps more romantic and haunting, and yes, it's still very solid in its own right too. If it is the weakest, it's really not by much. So okay, individual tracks. Rosa's title track is not nearly as big of an immediate attention grabber as Gelp's opener, nor does it feel entirely indicative as an opener. Instead feels more like a device to transition from the mood of Gelp into the mood of Rosa. It's got the super abrasive modern dubstep synth screeching and crashing everywhere to match that of what we were hearing on the last volume, even if they never really come back in the rest of the album besides maybe a little bit on Cambria. But the 5/4 time signature and more sentimental chord progression is a better indicator for what we're going to hear on the rest of the project. Kind of a weird way to open things up, but okay. New Plains is a track that seems pretty simple on its surface and is just your typical melodic track, but the 11/8 time signature is interesting, and the chord progression of this one is weirdly satisfying in a way that's hard to articulate. All these bright and flashy synths playing these chords which add up to something that feels kinda sadder but still hopeful, I guess. One of my definite favorites anytime it came up. And then there's Spiral Staircase, the microtonal one. Which is less notable a feature than I expected it to be. Well, it's a lot easier to notice in that chorus section, which is just climbing up and around the scale and making some jumps involving quarter tones. Yeah, it definitely has a weird off-kilter vibe that I typically feel whenever quarter tones get involved. And I can see why the song is titled after it. Outside of that, this isn't a track that really popped out at me in the big scheme of things. It's cute, it's low-key, it's a nice duet between her and that vocal generator she used on that one track from The Best Day that became a viral meme in France. The microtonal key changes fit into the track seamlessly without me even blinking at them, and I wish I felt more strongly about it than I do, but yeah, good track. But okay, from there we get a bunch of big standouts in a row. Courtship sticks out just looking at its 9-minute length. And while again there's not a lot to it, it takes like half the track for percussion to show up, and much of the percussion sounds like a gazillion fireworks going off in the distance. It's otherwise a triumphant poppy synth soundscape in her usual style that feels like it's got some classical influences going into it, and not in the Jean-Michel Jarre way. It's kind of got some weird, like, mismatched time feeling where, like, the underlying composition sounds a lot older than it actually is, but it's the way it's played on these polished modern synths brings up imagery of, like, people in 18th century dress on a space station or something like that. Like Treasure Planet, I don't know. Yeah, I really like that one. But while we're on the topic of modern classical, we're then led into The Delivery, which is just a very simple string quartet piece. Yeah, she went and hired a string quartet on Fiverr and got them to play this. It's just presented as is without any further accompaniment, and it is probably my favorite track on Rosa. I don't know what it is, among all these weird complex pieces and big flashy synth workouts, having this track come up just catches me off guard and ends up as a total emotional gut punch. Often almost gets me to even tear up a little bit. I am always a sucker for some good strings, and this was very, very well placed. But then from there we go into the 10-minute mammoth that is Cambria. While all the synth textures are pretty familiar, we got minimal whistling ambient pads, multiple layers of plinking chords that sorta harmonize but not perfectly, glitchy synth washes that feel like ocean waves that are clipping in and out of reality, a few squealing dubstep wubs that basically feel like additional textures to add some more punch, and even some pianos that show up in the second half, and even some very low-mixed chorus vocals coming in at the end. There's not really any change-ups or side tracks, just a track that feels like it naturally built up and paid off, albeit with a ton of different layers going into it. And it's not as flashy or attention-grabbing as you'd think, given the length, but the sheer amount of detail is really something to behold, and those 10 minutes go by pretty dang quickly. But then there's the What a Wonderful World cover, and, okay, I'll be blunt, this is my least favorite track in the whole trilogy. And it's not even that bad. I do like the ending where there's, like, this big burst of all these dense layers of synths and choir-like pads. That was a cool effect. But those sharper organ-like synths in the first half are pretty grating and thin, and that guest singer, I'm sorry, his performance was pretty subpar and didn't have much of an emotive presence. The track just kind of fell flat for me. It is thankfully also the shortest track in the trilogy. Hey look, it's 2:56. And I still don't mind it being there for the sake of pacing, breaking up the melodic meanderings of its surrounding tracks. And then there's the last stretch of tracks, which there's not a ton to note about these. There's the minimal and mysterious Aurora, a little dissonant ambient ditty that has a bit of a creepy bend to it. And the firework percussion comes back in the second half, turns into a nice little weird IDM lullaby or something. This one's a particular grower and a nice companion to Courtship that's similar in structure but opposite in mood. I really like that one. Voices, that one just kind of feels like a filler moment. It got some low-key minimal synth pad progressions and some tapping 8-bit percussion, with a bit more of a swell up in sound near the end. It doesn't stick out that much. And finally, we close with Old Ways, big 8-minute waltz thing with more generated vocals that do not seem to fully convey consonants, but hits the right emotional note, builds up quite nicely, and that whole second half with all these delicate synths going over this really frantic IDM beat that feels like it's tripping over itself, and sounds like it's got these weird DJ scratching noises in there, and even bringing in a stronger bass line at one point too. Good stuff. Kinda strange, if still fairly satisfying way to go out and lead into the next volume. I mean, on the whole, Rosa seems to find most of its power in its deceptive simplicity. I remember back when I reviewed her album Doraemon last year, and I ran into her track Since, I said I kinda wish for a whole album like that. And Rosa is kinda how I imagine such an album would play out, just without sample manipulation and stuff. These tracks may just stick to all these melodic synth textures, which are her usual hallmark and may not seem that interesting on the surface if you're used to her style, but they feel like they have a lot more effort and nuance put into them than they appear on the surface level. Sure, there's a few weaker moments here, yeah, the other two volumes hit with more impact than this, and Rosa probably would not be as good if it didn't have the context of the other two projects to compare it to. This album, more than any of them, feels like it was most meant to be listened to directly after Gelp and directly before Schwartz, and doesn't stand on its own as well. But it's got a lot of this trilogy's best moments too, still finds power in its subtlety. I can award this with a very strong 7.7 out of 10. But finally, that leaves us to Schwarz, the third volume, and my personal favorite of the three. This project is the most atmospheric and spacey of them, the one with the most stylistic variety, and the most consistent one quality-wise. The one where I had the hardest time deciding on a least favorite track by far. I mean, the other two volumes I kind of knew what my least favorite would be on first listen, and they never really changed from there. This one I cycled through a couple and none of them felt quite right. I eventually just decided on the title track as it felt just like an album intro rather than the kind of thing that stands up super well on its own right. With lots of abrasive noise spurting out and a swell up of melodic progressions under it. Does succeed in getting me hyped for what I'm about to hear though, pretty epic. Going from there, next you got Escape, which is where she starts to get her Eric Prydz on. Pretty thumping progressive house number, albeit not as punchy, but with a lot more layered sound design than most of his stuff. Lots of sparkling synths going around and echoing out into the distance. Sounds gorgeous, and that whistling beep sound that bookends the track sounds really familiar. I feel like she's used it before on an old album like Telecommunications or one of those, but I don't know. Still a great track. Something Pretty was probably my least favorite on here when I first heard the album, because I thought the Vocaloid vocals didn't sound very good, and their weird inflections kind of took me out of it, especially the way they say pretty with weirdly specific emphasis on the T. But this was not a complaint that held up even just on second listen or any subsequent time. It stopped bothering me, and that stripped-back piano instrumental stuck out to me a lot more. Also, the outro with all the synth buildups was a nice touch too. So that one did eventually turn out to be one of my favorites from here anyways. Next up is Moons, another pretty consistent highlight, albeit not one that I have much to say about. Some mysterious layers of sparkling synth progressions, and a beat that comes in later and really starts to hit hard. Sort of has a mild synthwave-y feel to it too, wouldn't have felt out of place on Rainbow Road. Then we got Ghost Note Groove. That one's a lot more interesting, most characterized by her manipulating these samples from a YouTube drumming tutorial, and often adding that dub echoing effect to them that kind of reminded me of The Orb. Also chopping up the voices more and pitching them up and down occasionally, even kind of YTPMVing them near the end. Meanwhile, the instrumental underneath is mostly just a simple drum break that bangs especially hard, and some muted synths that whir away under it and create some bassy tension. That track kicks ass, and I almost kind of wish there was more stuff on the project that sounded like it. Though it does also benefit from being the only track here that sounds like that. Just a big standout for me all around. Next up is the Paper Planes cover, which, that's kind of a weird one to quantify. I'll admit to not being much of an MIA fan myself, or particularly loving the original track, but this cover probably works better for me than it has any right to. I mean, she brings back that singing text-to-speech voice that she used when she covered Jessie J's Domino to less than successful results. And you would think that said voice singing about wanting to shoot you and take your money over a similar light and playful synth instrumental would just be totally ridiculous and not work at all. And I wouldn't say it's not still kind of ridiculous, but I don't know. Like, the instrumental has a lot more body and weight than the totally undercooked Domino cover. Has some actual groove to it as well. And replacing the gunshot and cash register sounds with, like, video game sound effect equivalents is kind of brilliant. Again, she is going all the way with this idea and definitely making sure that it has separate appeal from the original. I don't think it's one of my biggest favorites on the album, but I do still quite like the way it turned out. And then there's the final stretch of the album. You got an 8-minute pure ambient cut in chorus, getting some Tangerine Dream-ish vibes off of that one. All these progressions of low-key plinking synths building up and creating this soaring, expansive vibe. That was great and well made use of its length. You got Out of Space, which combines that same kind of low-key, ambient-centric instrumental with some super loud and hard-hitting modern dubstep drops. Kinda reminds me of BT's 13 Angels on My Broken Windowsill. Doesn't transition between the two styles nearly as smoothly or hit as satisfyingly as that track, but does kind of have the two styles directly playing off each other in a cool way. Still got the plinking ambience echoing out over the top of all the intensive and abrasive wubbing. That one was solid. But of course, we've saved the best track for the very end. Fly is a pretty solid contender for best track in the whole trilogy. This total triumphant and soaring mix of glitched-up choirs and epic synth pads going over a fairly simplistic but driving percussion track. It's got the general vibe of a classic Robert Miles-style trance song, but made out of completely different sonic ingredients. Sounds absolutely freaking incredible, and maybe the most impressive production I've ever heard out of a Patricia Taxxon track to date. Not just a perfect ending to this project, but for all three. And yeah, that's Schwarz. Felt like the volume where she was pushing herself the most. Had the most consistent lineup of tracks, with no truly weak moments to speak of, and plenty of variety, and that all-around spacey atmosphere conveyed in every track works wonders for me. It was just freaking great. Like, a strong 8.3 out of 10. And now, final thoughts on this trilogy as a complete whole. Yeah, not much else to say that I haven't already. I feel like these three albums really complement each other well. They have their own separate appeals and vibes while still fitting together in the same package. All of them get better when you listen to them one after another. Maybe some of her modern dubstep excursions lose a bit of their punch in that context, since there are a lot of them. But no, they do still have different enough executions to still generally work for me. I feel like if I were reviewing this back in 2016, I would have said something dumb like, "This is objectively the best project she's put out to date." Because back then I frequently conflated being impressed by a project and its pure amount of substance or technical achievements with objective quality. Which, no, not actually how that works. That's still a subjective standard. But yeah, this trilogy is definitely her most impressive work, both from a technical level and in terms of substance and pacing that I've heard from her yet. And that just leaves the open question of how it's going to do in terms of replay value. I'll admit the urge to return to this one wasn't as strong as it was on Pixinbit when that first came out, and that's only partially due to the length. For what it's worth, even if this trilogy clocks in at over 2.5 hours total, and is in fact a fairly big commitment, I'm a lot more forgiving towards longer projects like these than I think most people would be. I mean, a lot of my all-time favorite projects are 2-hour double albums, and I've even made a near 2-hour double album myself. I say so long as the length is well utilized and keeps me interested the whole time, then you can go as long as you want and I'll still be perfectly happy. I even tend to prefer longer projects over shorter ones. Pixinbit was obviously much tighter comparatively and just hit that sweet spot for me lengthwise at around 70 minutes. 12 tracks and basically all of them were great. This trilogy obviously had quite a few more weaker moments. The length means more room for error, but given the consistently spot-on pacing and amount of variety over the whole thing, these weaker moments are easier to forgive. Whatever the case, we'll see how much I'd want to return to this over the course of the rest of the year. We'll talk to me again for the year-end list. But right now, the package of the three albums together is probably my new current frontrunner for favorite album of 2020 so far. Just so much to dig into, and so much of it was great. Definitely make sure you give it a shot too. Das Triadische Ballett as a complete whole gets an 8.7 out of 10 from me. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.